Hello. For the past couple of weeks, we have been learning how to pick out an argument in, if not a sea of words, then at least a large pond, and how to transform it into something that we can understand, analyze, and criticize. Now, I don't know if you're going to be using standard argument form and argument diagrams in your other courses or in your career. I mean, I do, but those skills are necessary if we're going to be able to really understand and criticize arguments. In particular, those skills are necessary for us to be able to understand certain classes of tricks or errors in argument that are called fallacies. Now, it's hard to give a good formal definition of what a fallacy is, so here's an informal one. A fallacy is a bad argument that nevertheless tends to persuade people. To understand why people can be persuaded by bad arguments, we need to talk about the difference between reasoning and persuasion. The art of persuasion, meaning being able to get people to do what you want or believe what you want, is called rhetoric. Arguments can be used to persuade, but the model of argument that I've been endorsing in this course is called rational persuasion. We can think about it in terms of what you see here on the screen. We normally think of argument as a dispute between at least two people who disagree about the truth of some claim. And I have a couple of examples here. Climate change is human caused. Plenty of people disagree about that, although they shouldn't. And here's another example, which is a whole other kind of argument. You don't love me. Reasoning is a different approach to argument. In fact, you could think of it as a whole other thing. Reasoning is less about persuasion than it is about reaching the truth or the position on a particular topic that is most likely to be true, the position that is most worthy of belief, you could say. Reasoning is not a dispute. You don't need two people to have an argument in this sense. An essay can present an argument. Reasoning is not adversarial. People, that is, human beings, I assume you've met one, are resistant to changing our minds for all sorts of reasons that you're probably already aware of. But if someone changes your mind through rational persuasion, you haven't lost anything. In fact, that person has done you a favor because they've brought you closer to the truth. In fact, it's time for a spontaneous anecdote.
In this lecture, I'm going to be making use
of footage from live Zoom lectures that I gave during the pandemic. I've done that before, right? In one of the Zoom lectures that I'm going to be using today, I talked for, I don't know, 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes about reasoning and fallacies, referring to stuff that was on the slides, but my students couldn't see the slides because I had forgot to click share screen. I did eventually remember, but everybody would have been better off if somebody had told me that I had forgotten to share the screen right at the start. For the next 3 weeks, starting with this one, we're going to be talking about fallacies. You can think of this as a counterpoint to the 3 weeks that we spent on different forms of inference. Inference is all about how we know things. the good and logical reasons to believe that something is true. But often, way too often nowadays, people believe things for bad reasons. Fallacies exist because people, you know, humans, you've probably met one, are not very good at reasoning. Being bad at reasoning doesn't make someone dumb. You would be amazed at how bad I was at speaking French before I learned how to speak French. Get it? People are not good at reasoning until they learn how to be good at reasoning. We may laugh at people who believe conspiracy theories, but we shouldn't. People who believe in conspiracy theories believe in them for reasons. They're just bad reasons. And they haven't been taught how to tell the difference between good reasons and bad reasons. And to show you what I mean, I've prepared a 30-minute component on conspiracy theories, which I'm going to append to the end of this week's lecture. I think you will find it really helpful if you're wondering why and how the world seems to have gone completely insane.
What is a fallacy? Well, let me back up a little bit. The reason why we talk about fallacies in this course is because we want you to be able to tell the difference between good arguments and bad arguments. And we think that's important because there are a lot of bad arguments out there. This is a self-defense course, I like to say. It is a course in logical self-defense. Logical self-defense means protecting yourself from being fooled by bad arguments. Which brings us to the topic of fallacies. It's pretty hard to give a really good formal definition of what a fallacy is. So here's an informal definition. One way of describing what a fallacy is a bad argument that nevertheless tends to persuade. Or to put that another way, you could say it's a bad argument that looks like a good argument, something like that. The other thing about fallacies is that they're problems in arguments, but they're problems in arguments which are common and fall into certain patterns. These patterns have been identified by philosophers and other arguers over the years, mostly philosophers, and they've been given names and criteria, and a lot of people find them helpful when it comes to, well, not just to evaluating arguments, but also it's simply with, well, more so really, with not being fooled by bad arguments. A third advantage to learning about fallacies, of course, is so that you don't make fallacies yourself, so that you don't commit these particular argument errors yourself. Because like I said, these are common mistakes or tricks. Fallacies are often made in an argument not on purpose, simply because people are not good at reasoning or making arguments until somebody teaches them how to and they get lots of practice. But even more frequently, a fallacy, like the kind of argument mistake that usually falls under the heading of a particular fallacy, often it is a deliberate attempt to trick you or to derail an argument. So it says here on the slide, two different categories of fallacies. Rhetorical fallacies work by distraction or derailing the argument, and logical fallacies are tricks or errors in arguments that we commonly overlook. So logical fallacies occur sort of within the reasoning of an argument, whereas rhetorical fallacies tend to distract you away from the argument or derail the argument, something like that. How useful is this distinction? I don't know. If you find it useful, great. If you don't find it useful, forget it. The fallacies all have their different names anyway, so they're already categorized. There's a lot of fallacies. There's not a precise number, and we don't have time to go over all of them. Of course, it would be nice. It would be, I'd enjoy teaching a whole class on fallacies because they can be entertaining, they have cute names, and finding fallacies in text has that whole sort of gotcha feel where, you made a mistake there, which, is kind of satisfying and fun if you have a particular kind of mind, but we're only going to be spending 2 weeks on them, and so we're only going to be covering a relatively small number. The ones that I picked to cover are common ones and also ones that, just the ones that I think are going to be most relevant and fit in best with the overall purposes of the course. So the way this is going to work mostly is I'm going to give you a piece of text and we're going to try and figure out what's wrong with it, and that's how we're going to learn how these fallacies work. I'll read this out. Free trade will be good for this country. The reason is patently clear. Isn't it obvious that unrestricted commercial relations will bestow on all sections of this nation the benefits which result when there is an unimpeded flow of goods between countries? Okay, this is a paragraph. It's presenting an argument. Somebody tell me, what do you think is the conclusion of the argument here? What are they trying to prove?
Free trade is good for the country.
Yes, free trade will be good for this country. It's the first sentence and its conclusion. It's what they're trying to prove. And we know that, because look at the second sentence, the reason is patently clear. So now it says it's going to give a reason in support of this. So this next sentence here, sorry, I'm having trouble highlighting. This next sentence here is supposed to be the reason in support of free trade will be good for this country. So let's read it. Isn't it obvious that unrestricted commercial relations will bestow on all sections of this nation the benefits which result when there is an unimpeded flow of goods between countries? So let's put it in the form of a question, but it's saying it's obvious that this. But let's look a little bit more closely. What does unrestricted commercial relations mean? What's a different way of saying that?
Free trade.
Yeah, unrestricted commercial relations is just another way of saying free trade. Unimpeded flow of goods between countries. What's another way of saying that?
Free trade.
Yeah, that also is just saying free trade in more and larger words. And finally, the other part of the sentence is bestow on all sections of this nation benefits. Well, what is a different way of saying bestow benefits on all sections of this nation? Isn't that the same as saying will be good for this country? Isn't bestowing on the nation benefits, that's just saying it will be good for this country in different words. This is the conclusion, right? And this is the premise down here. So it's saying free trade will be good for this country because free trade will be good for this country. It's just repeating the conclusion again using different words and fancier words in the hope that they will be able to fool you. So you detect begging the question by seeing if you can rephrase premises so that they're just saying the same thing as the conclusion. There's a simpler example, if you find that one easier. The belief in God is universal because everyone believes in God. This is a pretty obvious case of begging the question, because everyone believes in God is the same thing as saying the belief in God is universal. And so it becomes the belief in God is universal because the belief in God is universal. So you can detect begging the question by looking at the wording and the premises and seeing if you can replace the wording so that it's the same wording as in the conclusion while preserving the meaning. In other words, exactly what we did here, right? Unrestricted commercial relations. Can we rephrase that Yes, we can rephrase it to mean free trade. Unimpeded flow of goods between countries, well, that's another way of saying free trade, and the other bit as well. So if you can do that while preserving the meaning, then you have shown that the argument commits the fallacy of begging the question. All right, so the next one that we will look at is the next one on the slide, which is called false dilemma. The example is a famous quote from former President George W. Bush, and this was after the 9/11 attack and the whole war on terror thing started. So President Bush famously said, addressing nations, also people in America, he said, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." Sometimes when they quote that, they say instead, "You're either with us or against us." But I looked up, yeah, mostly people say that he said, "You're either with us or against us," but I looked up the actual quote, and what he said is, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." This is an example of the fallacy of false dilemma, because why? Bush is presenting you with two alternatives. You're either on the side of the war on terror, you either support the war on terror, or you're on the side of the terrorists. That doesn't sound very nice. It's not very nice at all, but there's also a logical problem here. What's wrong with it logically? There's more than two options. He says you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, but it's possible for you to neither support the war on terror nor be on the side of the terrorists. You can be neutral. So that's why this is an example of the fallacy called false dilemma, which occurs when we're presented with two alternatives, but those are not the only two alternatives available.
It's also possible to interpret W's words as a threat, meaning something like, either you side with us or we will treat you like you're against us. In this case, it would be an example of a different fallacy.
So the reasoning, if you were to make this into a syllogism, it would be, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Second premise, you're not with us, therefore you're with the terrorists. So either A or B, not A, therefore B. So this is this either A or B, not A, therefore B. This is a valid argument form. Like, it's okay to argue in this way if it is true that you only have the two choices, A or B. So whenever you see somebody in an argument and they say something like this, you're either with us or you're against us, or it either has to be one way or the other, and it can't be the second way, so the right way is the first way, something like that. So when somebody asks you to make a choice between two alternatives, a little bell should go off in your head, and you should say, hey, I wonder if this is a false dilemma fallacy. And then you ask yourself the question, are there more than these two alternatives that are stated? Sometimes there won't be. Sometimes there will be only two alternatives. The light switch is either on or off. You're either pregnant or not pregnant. There's no middle ground. But sometimes there is a third option or a fourth option, etc. More than two options, more than the options stated. And in that case, they're committing a fallacy. It's a fallacy because they're misrepresenting the facts, right? They're misrepresenting the situation as you only got two alternatives, but you have more than two alternatives. So one of the premises is false. But this shows up often enough that it's worth treating as its own special category, the fallacy of false dilemma. So when somebody presents you with a choice between two alternatives as part of an argument, ask yourself, are there really just these two alternatives, or are there more than these two? Or is there at least one more alternative? And if you can think of one, then you can show that it's a fallacy of false dilemma and that the reasoning doesn't follow. But if you're doing this as part of an assignment, like for example, let's say there's a false dilemma in your homework for next week, you need to do more than just say there's more than these two alternatives. You need to give a third alternative. You need to give at least one more alternative. Okay, so it's not adequate just to say there's more alternatives. Give an example of one. Another way that might help you to detect fallacies of false dilemma is that they often present matters in extreme or oversimplified positions. A better example would be somebody who is in favor of stronger regulations on businesses, and then somebody says, oh, that sounds like communism, but it's obvious that we have more than two choices. We don't have to either have no regulations on businesses, or we have to have communism, which basically means the government owns all of the businesses. There's obviously a middle ground. So when somebody is, it looks like somebody is oversimplifying something, putting something in the form of extreme positions, that is another hint that the fallacy of false dilemma may be present. So there's a variation on the false dilemma fallacy, which people have given its own name. This is called the nirvana fallacy. So it's a kind of false dilemma. It's specifically when someone rejects a proposed solution to a problem by pointing out that the solution is not perfect. There was a great example that I saw in the news in, I don't know, 2014. Like, I know to you guys, it seems like 2014 was a really long time ago, but things haven't really changed all that much since 2014. After one of the mass shootings, Barack Obama, who was president at that time, proposed a ban on assault rifles because assault rifles were commonly used in mass shooting. If you don't know what an assault rifle is, just think machine gun, something that can, fire continuous streams of bullets. And I read an argument against this by a political pundit who explained that actually the majority of shootings, the majority of gun deaths involve handguns and not assault rifles. So a ban on assault rifles, according to the statistics he gave, would reduce gun deaths by like 5% or something like that. So that was his reason why we shouldn't ban assault rifles. His reason was banning assault rifles would only reduce gun deaths by 5%. Is that a good argument or is that a bad argument? Okay, so it's a bad argument because if we can reduce gun deaths by 5%, that's still a good thing. There isn't going to be any legislation that's going to reduce gun deaths by 100%. So saying that this solution this proposal won't fix the whole problem is not a reason to reject the solution. I mean, it's not like the guy who was criticizing the proposed ban on gun rifles was saying, oh, instead we should ban handguns. He wasn't suggesting that. He was just pointing out, but you see, the problem with your proposal is that it won't completely eliminate gun deaths. Of course, Obama wasn't suggesting that it was even possible to completely eliminate gun deaths. It is impossible to completely eliminate them. So anyway, the logic of the nirvana fallacy is somebody proposes something and you want to reject that proposal, so you point out that it's not perfect. So you point out that it won't completely solve the problem. It'll only help. It'll only ameliorate the problem. Well, unless you're proposing a different alternative, which is going to do a better job of solving the problem, then saying that the solution is not perfect isn't a reason to reject the solution. What solution is ever perfect anyway? It's not like it would be a bad thing just to stop 5% of gun deaths in the US. That would still be saving hundreds of people per year. Moving on. Slippery slope? Yes. Even though marijuana has not been proven to be a dangerous drug, we should still not legalize it. If we do, many more people will start to use it. Inevitably, some of these people will turn to harder drugs like heroin or crack cocaine. And we've all seen the poverty, crime, and illness that these drugs cause. Okay, this is a paraphrase of an example that I got from a textbook. What is the conclusion? What is the arguer trying to convince us of? He's saying we shouldn't legalize marijuana, or as it's correctly called, cannabis. I put it in standard form for you. So this is an argument with 4 premises. 1, if we legalize weed, many more people will use it. Premise 2, if many more people use it, then some of them will turn to harder drugs. Premise 3, if people turn to harder drugs, poverty, crime, and illness will increase. I've inserted an implied premise. That's a bad thing. We don't want to increase poverty, crime, and illness. Therefore, we should not legalize pot. So this is an example of a slippery slope fallacy, which you can recognize because a slippery slope fallacy will normally point to a chain of consequences. Okay? So this says, if we legalize pot, then more people will smoke pot. Then it says, if more people use it, then some of them will turn to harder drugs. And then if that happens, then another thing. So there's a series of steps, right? That's an indication that you're dealing with the slippery slope argument. It's not a slippery slope argument just because it points to consequences, like a direct consequence. If we do X, then Y will happen, and we don't want Y to happen. That's not a slippery slope argument because it's only a slippery slope argument when there's a chain of consequences. If it's a direct consequence, well, you just ask yourself, will that consequence actually happen? Do we have evidence that it'll actually happen? That's the way you look at an argument from consequences. So please write this down. Not every time somebody points to consequences is it a slippery slope. There has to be a number of steps. Now, what's interesting about the slippery slope fallacy, I bet most of you have heard of it. Most of you have heard of a slippery slope argument. You may or may not have heard of the slippery slope fallacy. Most people don't think this is a fallacy. Do you remember when I said earlier on in this lecture, when I said that a fallacy is a bad argument that sounds like a good argument? Well, a great example of that is the slippery slope fallacy, because most people think that slippery slope is not a bad way to argue. But the fact is, it almost always is. Would anybody like to tell me why?
Is it because the conclusion is just so drastic that people are afraid of it and will buy into your premise?
Here, just gonna write that down. That's good. Yeah, that is one reason why slippery slope is a bad way to argue. There's more than one reason, but let's talk about yours for a bit. Yeah, so one of the ways a slippery slope argument works rhetorically is that it points to a really scary consequence, and that makes people not want to take that risk, even though it's probably, even though when you think about it, it's like very unlikely. You know, so for instance, like doctor-assisted suicide, right? Let's say the doctor-assisted suicide or euthanasia is being proposed as legislation, and somebody is arguing against it because they say, oh, if we do that, then sooner or later we will, like, people will be euthanizing their older relatives against their will because they don't want to pay to keep them in nursing homes. That sounds terrible. We really don't want that to happen. That is a terrible, scary consequence. Is it going to happen as a consequence of making assisted suicide legal? No, there's no reason to think that that would ever happen, but people get scared, and sometimes when people get scared, they don't reason as well. They don't stop and look to see if there might be a problem with the thing that scared them. So good, yes, that's one of the problems with the slippery slope. The other problem is the premises are at best likely and maybe doubtful. So going back to the first example, if we legalize cannabis, many more people will use it. Is that a fact? Do we know that to be true for sure? The research doesn't suggest it, by the way. If you look at places where it's been, oh wait, yeah, places where it's been, who can think of a place where marijuana used to be illegal and then they made it legal? Oh, right, the place where we live. Yeah, I still like this example. I'm going to keep using it even though it's outdated. But like, we know that when they made cannabis legal in Canada, it wasn't like suddenly everybody became a pot smoker. It's just everybody who was already a pot smoker stayed that way. And I don't know, like, do you know anybody who wouldn't touch the stuff, but as soon as the government started selling it, then they suddenly became pot addicts? No, it just didn't happen. So the first premise is doubtful and probably false. The second premise, if many more people start smoking pot, some of them will turn to harder drugs. Do we know that to be true? I don't know. We would have to go and look at the research. At the moment, it's doubtful. You also might want to raise the question, well, maybe some of them, but you know, how many is some? Like 1%? 1% is some, but is 1% enough that we should care? Third premise, if people turn to harder drugs, there'll be more poverty, crime, and illness. Again, are we sure this is going to happen? Is this definitely true? Or is it more like it'll probably happen? So like, hypothetically speaking, this is another way of explaining why a slippery slope argument is not a good form of argument. Let's say that every one of the premises in your slippery slope argument is like likely to be true. Like, it's a pretty compelling premise. In the case of this marijuana example, most of the premises are not very compelling. But let's say that they were better, okay? So let's say that you had an argument with 4 premises, like a slippery slope form of argument with 4 premises, and each one was 80% likely to be true. So you have like your first premise, and that's 80% likely. I don't even have to give content to it in order to explain my point. And your second premise is 80% likely to be true. Your third premise is 80% likely to be true. And your fourth premise is also 80% likely to be true. What is the likelihood of the conclusion being true? I'm going to pretend that somebody just said 80%. Is it 80%? No, it's not 80%. The reason why is because in order for the conclusion to follow, all 4 of the premises have to be true at the same time. So the correct calculation for probability here is 80% times 80% times 80%, or 0.8. I forgot what the x was, times 80%. Oops. So anybody want to, what does that add up to? How do you calculate that? What is the answer? 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8. I think it's something like 0.42 or something. You end up with like roughly 40%. So in this argument with 4 premises, each of which is 80% likely to be true, because all of them have to be true at the same time, the conclusion is not 80% likely, but in fact, it's only 40% likely, which means it's 60% unlikely, right? I mean, 40% likely means that it's 60% likely to not be true. So it means that the conclusion is probably false. And this is, I think, the more important reason why a slippery slope argument is almost always a bad argument. Because even when you're given good premises, even when the premises that you're given are likely to be true, since all of them have to be true at the same time, and there's a bunch of them, then it's going to be unlikely that the conclusion will be true. And this is interesting because it fits into one of those, like, our brains are just not built to do math. It's like a whole lot of the way assumptions that our brains make are the incorrect assumptions when it comes to math. So if you didn't know about how probability worked, you would think that if each premise is 80% likely and there's 4 of them, the conclusion is 80% likely. But that's not how probability works. They all have to be true at the same time, which means that the conclusion is not very likely at all. And since you're pretty much never going to get a slippery slope argument where all of the premises are certain, I mean, 80% is pretty good, eh? There's going to be a lot of claims that are not going to be as good as 80% likely to be true, since the various steps in your slippery slope are almost never going to be, oh, we're 100% sure that they're going to be true. There's always going to be this kind of a dilution of likelihood, because something has to happen, and then something else has to happen, and then something else has to happen. And it acts as if once you start down this route, like, you can't stop. And that's why it's called a slippery slope. You know, the idea is once you start walking down a slope, it gets harder. But most of the time that isn't true, actually. There might not be a slope at all. It's probably more likely to be like level. The first step on down a slippery slope doesn't compel you to take the second, third, or fourth step. Likewise, if an argument requires a bunch of steps and each step is only likely to be true, if there's a bunch of steps, then the conclusion is unlikely to be true. And that's why slippery slope arguments are almost always fallacies.
Next.
So the slide says, if you believe in the miracles of science, you should believe in the miracles of the Bible. If you believe in the miracles of science, then you should believe in the miracles of the Bible. And we'll say you should believe in the miracles of the Bible is the conclusion. Does anybody see a problem with the reasoning here?
Science isn't a miracle. It's literally science.
Yeah. I think what you're driving at is it's kind of like the definition of the word miracle, as we normally understand it, is something that defies scientific explanation, right? A miracle is something that can't be explained by science. So it says miracles of the Bible. I'm trying to think of some examples. I can remember Jesus turning water into wine and walking on water and raising the dead and stuff like that. Well, if we're to understand those things as miracles, basically means they're accomplished by magic, you know? So normally the way we use the word miracle, I'm going to say the literal meaning, even though nobody uses that word correctly anymore. The literal meaning of the word miracle means something that defies scientific explanation. So when we say miracles of science, or perhaps I should say, when we used to say miracles of science, we meant the really cool things that science can do. You know, things like smartphones, GPS, and Viagra. So in this figure of speech, the word miracle is not functioning literally in the sense of something magical. I'm sure the word miracle is sometimes used in this way, you know, like, oh, it would be a miracle if Professor Keeping started class on time this week, because he almost never starts class on time. Like that is a way we sometimes use the word miracle. It's not literally a miracle. It's something that's really unlikely. So what I am driving at is that the word miracle is functioning differently when it says miracles of science, which, as I said, is a figure of speech, in which the word miracle is being used metaphorically. Don't worry, I have more examples of this fallacy. Whereas in the second half of the sentence, the second clause, it says miracles of the Bible, and there the word miracle is functioning literally, which means in its core sense, which means something that can't be explained by science. Okay, so the problem is that the word miracles in miracles of science means one thing. It means the really cool things that science can do, but miracles in miracles of the Bible means things that defy scientific explanation. So the word simply doesn't mean the same thing. in the two different instances that it appears. So this is what we call the fallacy of equivocation. I've given you a definition here. A key term shifts its meaning within the argument. There's actually a bunch of different ways in which the fallacy of equivocation can be defined, but it all has to do with the fact that words can be ambiguous. The word could mean two different things, and in fact, in the argument, the word actually does mean two different things. So the same word shows up more than once, usually just twice, with different meanings. Words have lots of different meanings, and so it's easy to play upon the fact that a word can mean different things to make an argument seem valid when it's not actually valid. So a different way to explain that is, so this is a step-by-step method which makes it pretty easy to determine whether or not equivocation is present in an argument. So highlight the word or phrase that you think may be used inconsistently. For each occurrence of the term, substitute a synonym that fits in the context. So I want to practice on this. To begin, I'll just read the whole argument to you. 5 million illegal immigrants is an invasion. The military uses lethal force to stop invasions. Conclusion, the military should use lethal force to stop the illegal aliens. So as you can see, on the face of it, the conclusion appears to follow from the premises. The military uses lethal force to stop invasions. This thing is an invasion. Therefore, the military should use lethal force to stop it. But it seems to make sense, but on the other hand, it feels wrong. And since we suspect that what is wrong is equivocation, because after all, look, it's right up here on the slide. Since we suspect that there might be equivocation, we're going to use the method that I just showed you for determining whether equivocation is present. So which term is the term that we think might be the one that shifts its meaning from one claim to another? Well, it has to occur more than once, right? So it can't be immigrants. I bet some of you were thinking immigrants, but immigrants doesn't even occur in the second premise. It's invasion. 5 million illegal immigrants is an invasion. The military uses lethal force to stop invasions. One way of telling that this is the term that we have to check is because this is the term that connects the first premise to the second premise, right? You can see that the fact that it occurs in both of them is what makes the connection. So this term, if it were used correctly, if there wasn't equivocation, then the argument would be fine. But this term, if the two instances of the word invasion, if the meaning in these two instances were different, then the conclusion wouldn't follow. And that's another way of identifying which word may be equivocal, or which word that you ought to check to see if it's equivocal. But honestly, the easiest way to find it is just noticing that it occurs twice, and also, well, the definition that I originally gave you was a key term shifts meaning in the argument. Maybe I should say something about key term. It ought to be like intuitive. A key term is like a word or a concept that's you can tell that it's important in the argument. So for instance, you can tell that like this number 5 million, this isn't a key term. Like the argument would work exactly the same way if it were 1 million or 10 million or 200,000 or something. So it's not a key term. But immigrants is an important term. That's because that's in a sense what it's about. It's also about invasions. What I'm trying to say is this: it's not difficult to just recognize when a particular word plays an important role in an argument. It's not like the word is or the word the ever plays an important role in an argument. Okay, so that's step one. We've identified each instance of the term. So what would be a different way to say invasion that would make the first premise true. 5 million illegal immigrants is, keep in mind, it doesn't have to be one word. It can be a phrase. I used this one before. Like the last time I used this particular example, it worked fine, but I think we did have to substitute a phrase instead of just a word. 5 million illegal immigrants is, remember, it has to be something that makes the premise has to be true. So what would be a true way of describing 5 million illegal immigrants that sort of gets at what the premise is trying to say? It's a lot of people. It's more people than we want. It's a scary amount of people. But how about this? How about this? We could say 5 million illegal aliens is a potential threat to people who complain about immigration. Usually their motivation is either conscious or unconscious racism, but what they normally say they're concerned about is jobs, you know, the whole thing, like they're going to take away our jobs. So we could say 5 million illegal immigrants is a, actually I'm happy to get rid of the word potential, is a threat to our jobs. Okay, the military force uses lethal force to stop invasions. Okay, now, right now, like forget about what we said in the first premise. We're just trying to find a different way of saying invasions here. So it has to be different words, but it also has to capture the meaning. It also has to make the premise true. The military uses lethal force to stop, well, how about hostile, I got it. Hostile incursions. Do they mean the same thing? Is a threat to our jobs the same thing as hostile incursions? That's step 3. We ask if they mean the same thing. Does a threat to our jobs, which remember is a substitute for invasion. So this is like taking this is where we're putting in as a substitute for the word invasion, something that then the substitute is supposed to have the same meaning. Hostile incursions is a substitute which is supposed to have the same meaning as invasions in the second one. Do they mean the same thing? Does a threat to our jobs mean the same thing as a hostile incursion? A hint, I'm looking for no. Hostile incursion is obviously not the same thing as a threat to our jobs. So the conclusion doesn't follow. The conclusion doesn't follow because the two premises are no longer connected. The first premise is talking about a threat to our jobs. The second premise is talking about a hostile incursion, i.e. an invading army. An invading army, people taking away our jobs, totally not the same. So the premises are talking about two different things. So the conclusion can't follow, because in order for two premises to work together to support a conclusion, they ought to be talking about the same thing, right? You can't put these two premises together to get the conclusion because they're talking about two different things. They appeared to be talking about the same thing when we use the word invasion, but they were actually talking about different things. And the fact that the same word was used in both premises masked the fact that the two premises were talking about different things. And that might be the best way that I can think of explaining how the fallacy of equivocation works, in the sense of being a bad argument that fools you into thinking that it's a good argument. Okay, so I have this whole section on the format that I want you to use when you're criticizing a fallacy, and also the rationale for it. And the rationale is, I want the skills that you learn in this course to be useful to you in everyday life. And in everyday life, we cannot assume that the person that we're talking to is going to be familiar with the names and definition of these logical and rhetorical fallacies. And for that reason, how the fallacy works, the definition of the fallacy or the criteria for the fallacy, are more important than the name of the fallacy. Likewise, when somebody makes a fallacy, we can't assume that they understand what's wrong with the reasoning they used in the fallacy. Like, often people don't understand why slippery slope is not a good way to argue. You have to be able to explain it to them. And so the method or the format that I came up with is supposed to be useful for that purpose. You're supposed to be able to explain to somebody who's not already familiar with the fallacies what they're doing wrong. At the beginning, just write down the conclusion of the argument. This is actually kind of important, because in order for you to understand what's gone wrong, you need to know what's being argued. So that's why I want you to start off by trying to figure out what the conclusion is. So whatever the argument is trying to prove, first write that down. You don't need to write down the reasons. Then give me the name of the fallacy, a definition of the fallacy or the criteria for it, and then an explanation connecting the text of the argument to the criteria for the fallacy.